Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely massive. We are stepping into a masterclass on humanity's most ambitious blueprint, the 2030 Global Agenda. Back in 2015, all United Nations member states adopted this universal call to action, establishing 17 distinct Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So we're going to decode these goals. We're looking past the broad political rhetoric, and we are digging directly into the hard data, the structural challenges, and the staggering scale of what it actually takes to secure a sustainable future for our planet.
To make sense of this incredibly complex global syllabus, we're going to organize these 17 targets into 4 interconnected pillars: people and society, economy and infrastructure, protecting our planet, and peace and partnerships. And then we'll wrap up with a final countdown to 2030.
Okay, let's set the foundation here. Before we break down the individual pillars, we absolutely have to understand one core academic concept. These goals are deeply intrinsically integrated. You literally cannot balance social sustainability without also having economic and environmental sustainability. They are fundamentally designed to bring the world to several life-changing zeros. We're talking zero poverty, zero hunger, zero discrimination. And the whole shebang is anchored by a single ultimate pledge: to leave no one behind.
All right, let's jump right into Pillar 1, People and Society. The sheer scale of the data here really illustrates the foundational challenges of our society. It's a real mix of incredible historical progress sitting right next to severe deficits. For instance, look at Goal 4. We've actually achieved a 91% primary enrollment rate in developing regions. That's a massive triumph for global education. But, and it's a big but, when you zoom out to the broader matrix, women are still systematically earning just 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. 400 million human beings have absolutely no access to basic healthcare, and an astonishing 2.3 billion people lack basic sanitation facilities.
This perfectly illustrates the crazy dichotomy of our modern era. When we talk about poverty, we really have to acknowledge a massive success. Extreme poverty dropped by more than half between 1990 and 2015. That was largely driven by rapid economic growth in countries like China and India. Yet at the exact same time, 736 million people remain completely trapped, struggling every single day for food, clean drinking water, and just basic human dignity.
Furthermore, the data reveals this stark geographic concentration. 80% of those living in extreme poverty, and by that I mean surviving on less than $1.90 a day, reside in just 2 major regions: South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. This tells us that if we actually want to eradicate poverty, our global resources have to be laser-focused on these highly vulnerable areas, which, by the way, are also facing severe threats from climate change and ongoing conflict.
Moving right along to Pillar 2, economy and infrastructure.
Looking closely at this economic breakdown, we see some profound structural imbalances. Think about it. How do you build modern competitive industry when 4 billion people, mostly in the developing world, don't even have internet access? How do you ensure decent work when 61% of the global workforce, that's over 2 billion people, are working in informal employment with zero basic legal protections? And perhaps the most striking stat of all, as of 2016, the top 1% of the global population held an incredible 33% of all global wealth. These kinds of infrastructural and economic divides completely stunt productivity, and they keep those cycles of poverty firmly in place.
And as a prime example of systemic inefficiency, consider this number: 1.3 billion. That is the number of tons of food that gets wasted every single year. Let that sink in. While 821 million people are chronically undernourished, our daily consumer habits and broken supply chains are tossing out 1.3 billion tons of perfectly viable food. Achieving responsible consumption means we absolutely have to upend these deeply ingrained personal and commercial patterns.
We're also seeing the intense compounding pressure of urbanization. This comparison is vital to our syllabus today. Cities occupy a tiny sliver of the planet, merely 3% of the Earth's total landmass. Yet they generate about 80% of the global GDP, they consume up to 80% of our energy, and they pump out at least 70% of our carbon emissions. So figuring out how to make these tiny geographic footprints sustainable, that is absolutely paramount to the survival of the rest of the globe.
Which naturally brings us right into Pillar 3, protecting our planet.
These environmental indicators are so deeply linked, it's like a giant puzzle.
We have already caused approximately 1.0 degrees Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels. Meanwhile, our oceans are desperately trying to buffer this by absorbing 30% of the human-produced carbon dioxide, which is leading to severe ocean acidification. And up on land, we are losing 13 million hectares of forest every single year. Those are the exact forests we desperately need to act as carbon sinks and to preserve critical biodiversity.
Goal 13 outlines a very strict mathematical progression if we want to limit warming to the relatively safe threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. This isn't just some vague aspiration, it's a scientific formula. Step 1, we have to peak emissions immediately. Step 2, drop global net CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030. And step 3, reach a strict net zero by 2050. But here's the sobering academic reality. Current climate pledges under the Paris Agreement cover only about 1/3 of the emissions reductions we actually need to pull this off.
The data on our marine ecosystems is equally crucial. The ocean isn't just a pretty body of water. It literally represents 99% of the planetary living space by volume. Economically, it supports over 3 billion livelihoods and generates a market value of roughly $3 trillion every year. Yet, this massive engine of planetary health is being suffocated by unprecedented land-based pollution. We are now averaging 13,000 pieces of plastic litter for every square kilometer of ocean.
Now, let's look at Pillar 4, Peace and Partnerships. Look, none of the previous goals matter if we don't have peace, because armed violence and systemic corruption inherently destroy development. You simply cannot build sustainable cities or end hunger in a war zone. By the end of 2017, 68.5 million people were forcibly displaced by conflict, persecution, or violence. On top of that, 1 billion people worldwide are legally invisible. They lack basic legal identity or birth registration, meaning they are completely outside the protection of any formal legal system.
This contrast here is just wild, and it brilliantly highlights a striking empirical disparity in global finance. On one hand, the official global development aid meant to help developing nations comes in at roughly $147 billion. But on the flip side, corruption, bribery, theft, and tax evasion drain a staggering $1.26 trillion out of developing countries every single year. So the illicit financial drains vastly outweigh the official development aid that's actually trying to flow in. So to put the required scale of partnership into perspective, the UN Conference on Trade and Development estimates that achieving these sustainable development goals is going to require between $5 trillion and $7 trillion in annual investment. 5 to 7 trillion. That is a price tag that cannot be covered by government aid alone. It's going to require a massive, fundamental realignment of private capital, sustainable investments, and global bond markets to fund our collective future.
All right, bringing it home with the final countdown to 2030.
If you take away just one thing from this explainer, let it be this. You cannot isolate these goals. They are a fully integrated ecosystem. You can't solve hunger without stabilizing the climate that allows us to grow our food. You can't grow the economy without empowering women, providing decent work, and establishing institutional peace. Action in one single area fundamentally dictates the outcomes in all the others.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly vital question. Recognizing the immense structural, environmental, and financial hurdles we've unpacked today, is global society actually ready to do what it takes? Are we prepared to mobilize the trillions in capital, overhaul our daily consumption habits, and deploy the sheer political will necessary to leave absolutely no one behind? It is a monumental syllabus to complete by 2030, but as the data clearly shows, our very future depends on it. Thanks for focusing in with us today, and keep learning.